Welcome to Connecting the Dots, the channel where we follow the breadcrumbs and try to predict where disruptions will take us. I've always been a car guy. I love European cars and American cars, Teslas and Japanese cars. I love driving and reading on them, and in the classic Ford versus GM battle, I've always bled GM colors. I've been making videos about these two companies for over 3 years. So when I set out to analyze their newly revised EV plans, I thought nothing would surprise me. But what I uncovered shook me to my core. So much so that I did two things I never imagined. First, I stopped being a GM fan, and I'm now rooting for Ford. And second, I bought GM stock. So what could possibly make a lifelong GM fan switch to Team Blue? And what could make someone all in on Tesla buy GM stock? Let's find out. I promise it will shake you too. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It really helps, especially early in the video. A huge thanks to my amazing patrons who make these deep dives possible. You guys rock. If you too would like to support the channel, please subscribe to me on X or join me on Patreon starting at $1 a month. Now buckle up and get ready, because with Tesla and China looming, this GM Ford showdown is disruption live, and disruptions are never boring. Chapter 1. GM's Perfect Plan.
Mary, when we talked with you, a couple of weeks ago at Investor Day, one of the goals that you guys stated emphatically was you will be the market leader in EVs. But right now, Tesla's at 63% market share. By 2025, some believe that you can catch Tesla. You guys are at, 9-10% right now in the U.S. Do you think that you can catch Tesla by 2025?
Absolutely, Phil. When we look at the portfolio we have, not only the Hummer and the Lyriq, but Mark Royce talked about that we're going to have a Equinox-like size product that's going to be at around $30,000. We have the Silverado E coming, a GMC product after that. And again, all the other products that we haven't announced yet, I am very comfortable because when people get into these vehicles, they are just wowed. So we will be rolling them out, and we're going to just keep working until we have #1 market share in EVs.
It seems like Mary Barra was lying to pump the share price when she said that GM would pass Tesla by 2025. The thing is, she was not. GM had a perfect plan, which could have worked, but then something unexpected happened, which sent them back to the drawing board. But to fully understand their plan, we need to go back in time and land in China. 1A, China, a strategic gamble. No one could have guessed from the low-rent cars GM made at the turn of the century that GM was an engineering powerhouse. Their research department was forward-looking. The groundbreaking EV1 was years ahead of the competition, and they even invented the electric skateboard over a decade before Tesla started using it. But when GM's management had the EV1 crushed and all EV projects stopped, their best engineers left to other companies or academia. And when years later GM returned to making EVs with the Bolt, they couldn't even develop it in-house. While GM Korea handled traditional aspects like styling and chassis, every EV component, from battery to motors to controls, had to be outsourced to LG. As the saying goes, you snooze, you lose, and having been dormant for over a decade, the former EV technology leader had become a follower. But snooze is a bit misleading because GM didn't completely sleep. There's a saying that, if you can't do, teach. And GM was awfully busy passing their knowledge to others. GM had lucrative joint ventures with SAIC in China, which made them a lot of money. For years, GM used older designs in their JVs, making sure not to pass the latest and best technologies to a company that could one day become their competitor. Following the 2008 crash, however, things changed. Just as U.S. taxpayers handed GM a huge bailout, GM received an additional, smaller bailout in China. In 2009, SAIC helped GM secure loans from Chinese banks for its international operations, and in return, GM renamed its GM China joint venture to SAIC GM. They gave SAIC controlling interest, and they agreed that any future new energy vehicle that GM develops, meaning EVs and hybrids, would be done in China. Let me repeat that last one. GM agreed that all future EVs and hybrids would be developed in China, together with SAIC. For years following this agreement, GM dawdled in America and Korea and only produced Chevrolet Bolts using LG technology. In Shanghai, however, they were busy teaching their Chinese partners how to make generation after generation of increasingly better hybrids and EVs. From an MBA's viewpoint, the logic seemed perfect. Having SAIC GM handle EV development meant that SAIC would share half the large development cost. Add to that labor is cheaper in China, and you have a winning formula. Build the cars in China's modern factories and then export them globally, including to America wearing GM badges. And while you're at it, why stop at EVs? Why not do that with all cars? Minimal investment and maximum profit. Wall Street would love it, and the customers wouldn't even know. But from an engineering standpoint, this is insanity squared. Giving up GM's core IP not only built SAIC as a formidable competitor, but also dumbed down GM's independent engineering capabilities. Here's what Sandy Munro had to say.
That's what the Chinese did. They brought us, from an engineering standpoint, they brought us in. They brought in, actually, they paid BMW and Mercedes and GM and everybody else. Hey, come on, Volkswagen especially. Come on to China. We'll give you all kinds of free stuff and whatnot. Show us how to build a car. We gave it all away. I mean, how dumb. I mean, and I look at things like this and I go, this is plain old stupid. Why did you do that? And then well, you know, it was financially prudent at the time. But you gave away all your profound knowledge. You trained your enemy. Why did you do that? Well, it was unprecedented, really. You remember a company called McDonnell Douglas? They gave everything away to Airbus. They gave it away. Oh, hey, we're got those French guys to make these parts. Really? And I can go and look at thousands of different examples like that. We give it away, and then, we shouldn't have done that. It's just amazing. And it happens over and over and over again. How do we miss this?
1B, GM's Trojan horse. If GM planned to flood American roads with Chinese-made cars, where are the cars? The canary in the coal mine arrived in 2017, when GM started importing to America the plug-in hybrid version of the Cadillac CT6, essentially a Chinese-developed PHEV based on GM Volt technology. Shortly after, they brought over the Buick Envision SUV, which, from that day going forward, including now, is the best-selling Chinese car in America, 7 years in a row. Of course, few people know the cars are Chinese designed and made, but that's the whole point. It's very likely that one day SAIC will sell cars under its own nameplates, but doing so now would be an uphill battle. Americans are pretty sus towards Chinese cars, and entering the U.S. market could be extra hard for SAIC, considering that unlike BYD and Geely, SAIC is state-owned, which means run by the Communist Party. Chinese companies think very long-term, so SAIC's dreams of Chinese brands filling American roads can wait. For now, it's much easier to don sheep's clothes by entering markets under local brands, such as MG in Europe and Chevrolet, Buick, and Cadillac in America. The CT6 PHEV and the Envision were GM's first toes in the water. After them, GM planned to import to America many other Chinese cars, including a full range of EVs. Here is where GM's history comes into play. Ford's Mach-E is based on an internal combustion engine platform, and Ford's F-150 and BMW's current EVs explicitly share platforms with their gas-powered siblings. But having invented the EV skateboard, GM knew better. With their modular 2002 skateboard still in mind, GM skipped conventional platforms and went directly to designing Faultium. This was a modular battery skateboard combo on which GM could produce anything, from small compacts like the Chevrolet Equinox EV to behemoths like the Hummer EV or BrightDrop electric van. We'll get back to the Hummer later, but think of it for a moment. The vision GM had at the turn of the century when they were still innovative enabled SAIC and GM to leapfrog all other OEMs and prepare to tackle all parts of the EV market in a multi-pronged shock and awe attack. With a highly developed supply chain around its factories in China, SAIC GM got ready to push the button and start ramping up to dizzying numbers. Mary Barra wasn't lying. GM did have the perfect plan to conquer the American market and possibly pass Tesla in U.S. sales. But several years have passed, and so far, they did not. So what went wrong? Trump did. Or rather, the tariffs he put on Chinese vehicles. 1C, Trump's game-changing tariffs. In July 2018, the first wave of tariffs hit Chinese cars with a 25% levy, and in 2019, President Trump announced another 5% tariff increase, potentially pushing the total to 30% on Chinese autos. The auto industry's response to these tariffs was revealing. Both Ford and GM lobbied against these tariffs, but for fundamentally different reasons. Ford had virtually no Chinese vehicles destined for U.S. import, but exported over 16,000 vehicles from America to China in 2018 alone. Their concern was straightforward. Retaliatory tariffs from Beijing would devastate their export business, potentially closing off a growing market they'd spent years cultivating. GM, meanwhile, found itself in a more compromising position. Their Chinese sales were produced in China, so it weren't retaliatory tariffs they were fearing. But having invested billions in Chinese manufacturing infrastructure and planning to start mass importing Chinese vehicles to America, GM was directly in the tariffs' crosshairs. When lobbying to remove the tariff failed, they tried to at least have the Buick Envision exempt from it. Their arguments against the tariffs were revealing. They claimed exemptions were necessary for the Envision to compete against foreign competitors, including Acura and Audi, seemingly forgetting that many of these foreign vehicles were actually manufactured in North America. The tariffs effectively derailed GM's wider Chinese import strategy before it could fully materialize. While the Envision continued to be imported, and despite the tariffs, it remains year after year America's best-selling Chinese vehicle, plans for broader Chinese-made GM vehicles to flood the American market were shelved. With profit margins squeezed by the 25% tariff, and EVs still expensive to build, the economics simply didn't work. This roadblock forced GM to reconsider its approach to the EV transition. We'll get to GM's new plans soon, but first let's discuss a few differences between GM and Ford and see where Ford stands in all of this. Researching for these videos, besides tending my engineering career and family life, makes me very aware of the importance of time. Time is our most valuable resource, and when I find tools that enable me to make the most of it, I cherish them. I use AI extensively to save time and improve my results, and for the last year and a half, I've found Ground News, the sponsor of this video, extremely useful for that. Ground News was created by a former NASA engineer. It provides a data-driven approach to understanding news coverage by taking every perspective covering a story and breaking down each source's political bias, factuality, and even the financial interests behind the headline. Take the reporting on GM's last earnings call. Ground News aggregates this data beautifully. With one click, I get a comprehensive analysis of 81 sources, which Ground News found covering this story, including the different way it's reported from right and from left. The platform's bias distribution chart instantly visualizes which left, right, and center-leaning outlets are reporting it. It's like having a media bias dashboard. You can literally see where your news is coming from. Interestingly, over 60% of the outlets reporting on GM's earnings call are from the center, a far cry from Tesla's earnings call, where over 60% were biased right or left. I guess GM is ruffling fewer feathers than Tesla and gets less biased coverage. One of the features I love is how easy it is to identify the reliability of information at a glance. Ground News factuality ratings let you see which sources are highly factual and which lean more towards sensationalism. Ground News lets me choose my sources knowingly and dig into the news as deep as I want, or just get the basics at a glance. To try it yourself and support this channel, head to ground.news/ctdots or scan the QR code. You'll get 40% off unlimited access to the Vantage plan I use. So go to ground.news/ctdots and experience it yourself. Chapter 2. The Culture Clash. 2A. Car Guy versus MBA. Jim Farley is a car guy through and through. His passion for automobiles runs deep. He's an avid car collector, vintage racer, and enthusiast who has spent his career immersed in the automotive world. He owns and races classics like a 1965 Ford GT40 and a 1966 Shelby Cobra, and he once described driving his GT40 over 200 miles per hour as his yoga. And when Farley speaks about Ford's future, there's something personal in his voice. His grandfather worked for Henry Ford as employee number 389 of the Ford Motor Company and worked on the Model T production line at Highland Park. That connection runs deep. It's not just business, it's in his blood, and Farley will do his darn best to have Ford thriving, another century from now. Mary Barra's style is calculated and corporate, less about the romance of cars and more about shareholder value. She is GM's largest private shareholder and a constant seller of shares, disposing of them as soon as they vest. This makes her highly incentivized to keep share price high in the short term. When a company has debt, sometimes milking it dry and then letting it default leaves shareholders wealthier than if it fights to keep afloat. In such cases, the CEO's sentiments and incentives can be the deciding factor between emptying the company's coffers or rolling up the sleeves and fighting for dear life. If this seems theoretical, it isn't. The exact same thing has happened before. 2B. Two opposing strategies. In 2008, when the financial crisis threatened to destroy America's auto industry, this long-term mindset drove radically different responses from Ford and GM. In the years preceding 2008, GM emptied the company's coffers and stuffed over $36 billion in dividends and buybacks into shareholder pockets. Then, once the going got tough and with little money in the company's war chest, GM arranged a bailout where the old company died, government motors appeared, and taxpayers footed the bill. And while GM emptied its war chest, Ford filled it up. Under CEO Alan Mulally and with Ford family support, Ford mortgaged everything, factories, equipment, and even their blue oval trademark to raise $23.6 billion. It was an all-or-nothing bet on Ford's survival as an independent company. At the time, this was seen as a risky, even desperate gamble, especially since the economy was still humming along. But Mullally's and Ford's reasoning was clear. Back in 2006, they wanted a cash cushion to fund a massive restructuring and protect against an unexpected downturn. That downturn hit hard in 2008, and Ford's war chest proved to be its lifeline. 2C, the difference in mindset. It could be argued that despite different outcomes, both companies scored a win, which confirmed to them that whatever they were doing was right. And while Ford's lesson was that bolstering the chest in preparation for hard times is vital, GM learned that emptying the war chest and taking the easy path is fine. GM learned that bullshitting shareholders floats the share price and makes shareholders richer, while Ford learned there's no substitute for being realistic and frank. And over 15 years later, these cultural differences shape each company's choice of CEO, as well as their approach to the EV revolution. 2D, hands-on versus remote leadership. Geared towards Wall Street and stock price, you won't catch Mary Barra in a competitor's car, let alone hear her speak about them favorably. Whenever she mentions driving, it's always a GM, and it always sounds like empty PR. And geared towards ground truth to keep the company alive, Jim Farley not only drives competing cars, but also openly admits their strengths. Let's listen to him talk to Robert in the Everything Electric show.
But I've had 2 trips to China in the last 2 years that were literally epiphanies, where I walked away. The last one was about the Xiaomi product, because in the West, our cell phone companies are not into car. They don't have car companies. Yeah. But in China, both Huawei and Xiaomi, the 2 biggest cell phone companies, are inside of every vehicle that is made. In fact, Xiaomi, the Apple, you could argue the Apple of China, they actually make their own car, the whole car. And now it's one of the best-selling cars in China. Yeah.
No, it is amazing. When you think of the sort of amount of our media attention and discussion and hypothesizing about the Apple car.
Yeah.
Which
this
we
is
never
twice as big. The market is more than twice as big in total, and the electric part of the China market compared to the US or Western Europe is like 20 times bigger. So you're exactly what you said. It's like everyone's talking about the Apple car, but the Xiaomi car,
which now exists and is on the road,
which now exists,
tens of thousands,
and it's fantastic. They sell 10,000, 20,000 a month. They're sold out for 6 months.
Wow.
You know, that is an industry juggernaut and a consumer brand that is much stronger than car companies. I don't like talking about the competition so much, but I drive the Xiaomi. We flew one from Shanghai to Chicago, and I've been driving it for 6 months now, and I don't want to give it up.
Right. Wow. That's an extraordinary thing to say, isn't it?
I don't know about you, but I cannot imagine Mary Barra saying the same about a competitor's car. Come to think of it, I don't see her talking this passionately about cars at all, even GM's. Farley's hands-on approach produces priceless feedback. Road tripping with his family in a Ford Mustang Mach-E, he realized how bad the charging experience for non-Tesla EV buyers is. Shortly after that road trip, Ford struck a deal with Tesla to use their network. And shortly after Ford's stock price jumped up at the news, Barra struck a similar deal. Chapter 3. Team Edison's Bold Experiment. 3A. The EV Skunkworks. When the EV revolution started gaining momentum, GM had a savvy partner they could rely on to solve the tech for them. Ford, however, found itself in unfamiliar territory. They could have followed GM's methodical approach of planning a perfect platform, designing the ultimate modular battery system, and waiting until everything was just right before production. But Jim Farley and his team recognized that in disruptive times, waiting for perfection is a luxury they could not afford. Being so far behind, they had a lot to learn. And since EV technology was rapidly moving forward and widening the gap, if they didn't want to get left behind, they had to learn fast. To do this, Ford embraced a philosophy more akin to Silicon Valley than Detroit. Fail fast, learn faster. In 2017, they established Team Edison, a Skunkworks operation initially comprising just a handful of employees. Named after Thomas Edison, the team embodied his famous quote, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." Team Edison was given extraordinary freedom, headquartered away from Ford's main campus, exempt from traditional approval processes, and empowered to move at startup speed. Their mission was clear: get Ford into the EV game quickly, learn from real-world experience, and establish a foothold while the technology evolved. Team Edison worked differently from the giant that Ford has grown to be. Instead of siloing development between different departments who work separately, in Edison, people from different skill sets all worked together as a group. They were given a mandate to cut corners and do whatever it takes to bring a competitive EV fast. The team was seen as a bet on the company's future, with EVs on the rise and Ford far behind. They were set ambitious timelines in a make-or-break effort to save Ford's future. When engineers are on a mission with their backs to the wall, that's when the sparks of creativity start flying. Here's what Sandy Munro had to say.
After 4 or 5 months, it gets really tough. And what happens when the situation is really tough? People get really smart. Engineers, when they're backed into the corner, that's when the brain starts moving. It doesn't move if it's, "Oh, I'll just make one like that one." You're never going to get you're never going to get rocket ships to the moon when you say, just make one like that one. Well, that was good enough. I'm sure it'll be good enough now. As soon as you've got that attitude, you're going to.
So how do you change?
And here are the besties in the All In podcast discussing how XAI managed to build the world's largest coherent computer cluster in record time.
But did you guys hear some of the stuff that these guys had to pull this thing off? One of the most incredible. So the way that Elon narrated it was, we first had a physical problem, so we just had to search all around the country for one single location where we could actually put 100,000 GPUs, and they found it, which was an old Electrolux factory in Memphis. Okay, yeah. That's kind of interesting.
But power.
Then he only had like 15 megawatts, and he had to get a 1/4 gigawatt, and so he had to basically buy every useful generator that was available. But then they had to liquid cool it, and so they bought 1/3 of all the portable liquid cooling capacity in America and located it on-prem. But then they figured out that there was a power problem. So then they took all these Tesla power packs and then had to do power smoothing, which had to rewrite all of the power pack firmware. In all of this, you know how we talked about DeepSeek being this moment where we had lost sight in America of capital being the source of innovation? He proves actually a more generalized rule that I took away from this, which is you always have to have a constraint. So meaning, let's say that there's like infinite capital in his case and infinite talent because he can basically recruit anybody he wants. What did he do instead? He created this artificial constraint of time. And so he was just able to say, you're going to get this done in a moment. The quality of Grok 3 relative to the amount of time that they've spent on this problem is, to me, what's staggering. So if you just sort of project the rate of change of this, and this is without judging OpenAI or Anthropic or anything else, those guys have been doing it for years. These guys have been doing it for a year. And they did all of this MacGyver engineering and were able to pull this off. So that's my second takeaway, is that innovation needs a constraint. Sometimes it's capital, sometimes it's talent, and
Physics.
Sometimes it's time. And so if you can basically be just completely rigid on one of those dimensions, you can get a great team to create something.
3B, learning by doing. Rather than waiting years to develop the perfect dedicated EV platform, Team Edison took a pragmatic approach with the Mustang Mach-E. They adapted an existing ICE platform, knowing it wouldn't be optimal, but would get Ford into the market faster. They benchmarked Tesla's EVs and aimed directly at their best-selling Model Y. The Skunkworks gave it everything they could on the EV side, and then Ford came in with all its might to tend to other aspects of the car and to the production side. Overall, Mach-E is impressive. It is a fun, roomy SUV with good styling and some ingenious touches such as a drain plug in the front, which makes it an icebox. As can be expected, however, its engineering was far from perfect. Sandy Munro's teardown famously revealed a cooling system that was overly complex and expensive, a battery structure that wasn't as integrated as Tesla's, and numerous other compromises. But from a learning perspective, it was invaluable. 3C, the F-150 Lightning, applying the lessons. Ford's engineers gained crucial real-world experience with battery management, motor control, and thermal systems. They identified bottlenecks in manufacturing and supply chains. Most importantly, they connected with customers and gathered feedback that no computer simulation could provide. This hands-on experience led directly to improvements in the F-150 Lightning. Its cooling system was dramatically simplified, and its overall systems integration showed marked improvement over the Mach-E. Each vehicle represented a generation of hands-on learning that competitors spending years in hands-off development would miss. 3D, the harsh reality of EV economics. The original financial calculations looked promising. Let's listen to Ford's former CEO Jim Hackett discuss them.
Jim Hackett, Ford's CEO, thank you very much for having us, and congratulations on the Mustang Mach-E. Will it turn a profit?
This will make a contribution margin, which is your revenue minus your cost, on vehicle number one. So that's surprising a lot of people because electrics have not had a history of making money. But this will. Now, of course, the amortization of the development, once you get that behind, it's totally profitable. We have to cover the cost of the invention.
So how have you done that, though? I mean, what kind of margins are you expecting on the Mach-E vis-a-vis your existing bestsellers?
Well, I can answer it this way. The design challenge was to take what has been missing in electric vehicles and create the passion that follows with Mustangs and marry those together. And so we've got a price point with the Mach-E base package that's in the mid-30,000 with the incentive, with the federal incentive here in the United States. And so it's going to be attractive to customers. It's going to make a contribution margin. It's a great story.
The Mach-E was projected to achieve positive contributing margins right from the start. This means that on paper each car would show a loss. But if we exclude the sunk cost of the factory and production lines, we'd see that it is actually profitable. With few cars being made, the factor's depreciation gets divided by a small number, which adds a lot to each car's cost. But as production volumes increase and capital expenditure gets spread across more vehicles, Ford could eventually turn a profit. But two factors upended these projections. First, sales volumes failed to reach targets, leaving Ford with high fixed costs spread across fewer vehicles. Second, Tesla aggressively slashed prices across its lineup, forcing Ford to follow suit or lose market share. The result was a financial bloodbath. By 2023, Ford was losing approximately $47,000 on every EV it sold, with total EV losses exceeding $4.5 billion for the year.
As soon as we all got chips and we started to produce in EVs, like us scaling, some of the manufacturers in Europe scaling, like VW, we found out that the mainstream customers were completely different to the ones that bought during COVID, and they were not willing to pay any premium for an electric car.
Right.
And that was a total game changer, because when we invested, we have a 4-year life cycle, the year or two before COVID, and then, of course, felt really comfortable with the prices during COVID. That 4-year period of ignorance, let's call it that, meant that we over-contented our vehicles, made the batteries too big, didn't experiment with battery chemistry, didn't experiment with advanced engineering or manufacturing, and the Chinese were, by the way. And so we found ourselves like upside down by $20,000 or $30,000 in terms of what the customer was willing to pay versus what it cost. So what happened after that?
The economics were unsustainable. While Ford's learn-by-doing approach had delivered valuable knowledge and established them until recently as the number 2 EV maker in America, the price was steep, far steeper than they had anticipated. Ford couldn't continue bleeding cash indefinitely while waiting for economies of scale to eventually make their EVs profitable. So they did two things. For the short term, to slow down the bleeding, they lowered production targets for their existing EVs. And for the long term, they devised a new plan. A plan that would leverage what they had learned while charting a more financially sustainable course through the EV transition. So far, Ford's EVs only brought losses. And since production is being scaled back, there isn't much hope of their being profitable. Judged by profitability, both vehicles were a flop. But overall, I see them as a big success. Team Edison's mandate wasn't profitability, but learning. And the Mustang Mach-E wasn't just Ford's first serious EV. It was a learning platform to bring Ford into the game. 3E, a long-term bet. Ford knew they'd lose money on early EVs. The goal was climbing the learning curve as quickly as possible. When Sandy Munro criticized the Mach-E's cooling system as overcomplicated, Ford's engineers didn't defend it. They studied his critique. The F-150 Lightning's cooling system shows they learned those lessons. For all the financial pain, something remarkable had happened. Ford had evolved from an EV novice to a company with real capabilities. They had built a supply chain, developed engineering expertise, and created vehicles customers genuinely wanted. This brought them into the game and gave them a chance to move forward. Had Ford tried to make an EV platform right from the start, they would be late for the game, and the platform would have numerous problems which Ford now knows to avoid. Ford's willingness to take a loss on these cars shows long-term thinking, the hallmark of infinite companies. It is something that GM have long lost, but Chinese companies have in droves.
They have their own billionaires in China that are shoveling money into these things, and they don't care about making money today. The objective is to win the war, not to appease somebody in Wall Street for next quarter. And until you have a long view, you can't beat these guys, period. They have like I said, they've been around for thousands of years. They have a whole different perspective on winning, and they have depth that is immeasurable.
Chapter 4. Break it to pieces. 4A. A lot to learn. Ford's journey into EVs with the Mach-E and F-150 Lightning wasn't just about getting products to market, it was an expensive education. While losing money on each vehicle, they gained invaluable insights that fundamentally changed their approach to electrification. They truly learned a lot. They learned about battery management, and about cooling systems, and how vertical integration is required to enable managing the car as a whole. Tesla's central processor controls all parts of the vehicle, while Ford's car is segmented between components from 150 different suppliers unable to talk with each other. Ford realized this must change. They learned how every gram saved is extra important with EVs. And most of all, they learned how badly they need to reduce costs. And by benchmarking cars like the SU7, they realized how far behind they were, and how they had no time to waste. So how could they shed significant weight and cost while accelerating development? The answer was radical. They would need to break their entire manufacturing approach to pieces and rebuild it from scratch. 4B, breaking it to pieces. Let's listen to Jim Farley.
And so we found ourselves like upside down by $20,000 or $30,000 in terms of what the customer was willing to pay versus what it cost. So what happened after that, and it depends on every company, I could certainly explain the Ford thing, is that we got real. We were like, okay, now we have to design a vehicle that's basically the same cost as a combustion hybrid vehicle in our case, and we cannot use a traditional approach like our Gen 1 products. So the Gen 2 products we've been working on for about 2 years, radical left turn in terms of our approach of engineering them and which segments will compete.
Right.
This is where Doug Fields' influence proved transformative. Since joining Ford from Tesla, Fields has quietly expanded his role to become the driving force behind Ford's next-generation EV strategy. Working with Team Edison, which has evolved from a Skunkworks into Ford's EV Center of Excellence, Fields is leading development of a completely reimagined manufacturing approach. The centerpiece is adapting Tesla's unboxed manufacturing method. Instead of building cars from hundreds of sub-assemblies, each requiring its own tooling, handling, and connection points, the unboxed approach reduces complexity dramatically. Major sections of the vehicle are constructed as single pieces, with wiring, cooling, and structural elements integrated into simplified substructures. 4C, Tesla Inside. But perhaps most surprising is Ford's willingness to collaborate with competitors. In a recent interview, Farley mentioned that Ford is considering licensing Tesla's full self-driving software. This wasn't just a casual comment, it represents a profound shift in thinking. FSD doesn't run in isolation. It operates on Tesla's central computing architecture that manages every aspect of the vehicle. For Ford to implement FSD, they would need that processor. And if they have Tesla's computer, adding Tesla's operating system and battery management are a no-brainer. If true, this should be a big win for both companies. For Ford, rather than spending billions to develop systems that would still lag behind Tesla's, using Tesla as strategic supplier would enable them to stay in the game while leapfrogging years of development. For Tesla, licensing their technology creates a new revenue stream while expanding their software ecosystem's reach. 4D. Trump's tariffs 2025. It's 2025, and with Trump announcing plans for high tariffs on Mexican imports, automakers heavily invested in Mexican production face significant risk. However, Ford should, in my opinion, be okay. While they currently produce the Mach-E in Mexico, their next-generation EVs, built on the new unboxed platform, should be made in America. The path forward isn't easy. Ford recently announced they're delaying the next-generation F-150 redesign until 2028, a painful but necessary move to preserve cash for EV development. They've also scaled back production of current EVs to reduce losses while accelerating work on their next-generation platform. Ford is making the hard choices necessary for long-term survival. They're investing in fundamental capabilities, manufacturing expertise, software integration, battery technology that can't be easily outsourced or imitated. "We're building this company to last another 100 years, Farley said recently. It's a statement that would have resonated with his grandfather on that Model T line, and shows just how different Ford's view of the EV revolution is from GM's stock price-based approach. I believe in Ford's team. Despite limited resources compared to industry leaders, they've demonstrated something essential for survival in disrupted industries: the willingness to break apart their own success formula and rebuild it from scratch. In the coming years, we'll see whether this painful reinvention allows them to thrive in an automotive landscape utterly transformed by Tesla and Chinese competition. Whatever they do, I will be rooting for them. And now, the part you've been waiting for. I hope you're sitting down because it's time for Chapter 5, GM's Perfectly Evil Plan. 5A. This changed everything. When Trump slapped a 25% tariff on Chinese vehicles in 2018, it wasn't just another policy change. It was an existential threat to GM's entire strategy. The economics were brutal and undeniable. A 25% tariff on vehicles already struggling with thin margins made the whole plan financially unviable. Imagine you've spent years building factories in China, developing a supply chain and training engineers, only to suddenly face a 25% tax that wipes out any profit margin. Now imagine that it wasn't even you that did all this. It was a joint venture company you are part of in China. And in this joint venture, your partners handled the tech while you handled tailoring the car better to American buyers' taste. In this case, now that the export option is blocked and you can't bring the cars to America, in America you are left without cars, without a factory, and without even mastering the tech. You have nothing. The tariff wasn't a speed bump. It was a roadblock that forced GM to completely rethink their approach. With billions already invested in preparing to flood American roads with fake GM cars, GM couldn't simply abandon its strategy. The question wasn't if they would proceed, but how they would adapt to this new reality. 5B. The Factory Zero Distraction. GM's new plan was to build the Chinese cars in Mexico, and we'll get to that in a moment. But starting from zero in Mexico would take several years. And with no new EVs to sell in America until then, GM feared that the markets would lose faith in the grand promises GM made before the tariff arrived. To remain relevant, GM took a unique approach. Something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. Something old was the venerable Chevy Bolt. GM extended the Bolt's best-before date and continues selling it until last year. The old pouch cell design resulted in several cases of battery fires, but with no other options available, the Bolt soldiered on, with a larger EUV version joining it in 2022. Something new were Factory Zero and the Hummer EV. Once the import route was blocked, GM had to show progress on the manufacturing side. They started building Factory Zero in the old Detroit Hamtramck plant and designed the Hummer EV. With no real experience building EVs by themselves in the last couple of decades, the Hummer is one pig of a design. I don't mean to detract from its off-road capabilities, which are extremely high. It's just that there's a lot of pork, it's highly inefficient, and the only way GM had to add range was by using a huge battery pack, which made the Hummer and all other trucks using that battery even heavier and too expensive to produce. Something borrowed was the Cadillac Lyriq, which GM borrowed from SAIC GM and arranged for expensive production in their Spring Hill factory. And something blue was the new logo. GM spent millions on rebranding itself with a new logo, because what better way is there to make markets believe in GM's EV future than to show them that GM itself believes in it? GM's American EV trucks are not a viable business, and GM is happy to use any opportunity they get to scale down production. The real business was the Mexican route. So let's get to it. 5C, the Mexican Workaround. GM's solution was elegant in its simplicity, yet breathtaking in its implications. If they couldn't import cars directly from China, they would import the designs and build them in Mexico. Under NAFTA, now USMCA, vehicles manufactured in Mexico can enter the U.S. tariff-free as long as they meet certain local content requirements. GM already had established manufacturing facilities in Mexico that could be retooled to produce EVs. What most Americans don't realize is that this approach preserves the essence of GM's original strategy. The vehicles are still designed by SAIC GM in Shanghai. The intellectual property still flows primarily from China. But by keeping final assembly and some of the components in North America, SAIC GM can sell in the USA under GM's nameplates, without incurring any tariffs. Let me know in the comments if you think this is cool. The first evidence of this approach appeared with the Chevrolet Blazer EV and Equinox EV, vehicles developed in partnership with SAIC and made in Mexico for the American market. Several other models are all set to go. And if you're wondering how profitable importing Chinese cars from Mexico is, here's John McElroy.
To also give GM a lot of credit, it is sticking largely, not entirely, to its EV strategy. And what they claim right now is that on a variable profit basis, i.e., don't count all the investment that went in, don't count all the engineering, just look at what it costs us to get all the parts and labor and make a vehicle, they're profitable right now. That's the first step. They're saying by the end of this year, things will look even better.
But that is assuming they're going to gain some scale.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, it does.
5D, the big picture. In all truth, checking GM's imports from Mexico is just half the picture. Zooming out reveals a troubling pattern of GM essentially becoming SAIC's global marketing division. In Mexico, the transformation is almost complete, and it's not just EVs. Let's visit Chevrolet's Mexican website and see for ourselves. Want small cars? The Chevrolet Aveo sedan and coupe look nice with their tempting $14,000 base price, but they're actually Model 310C from the SAIC GM Wuling joint venture, where GM owns just 44%. The $17,000 Chevrolet Cavalier Turbo? That's the SAIC GM Chevrolet Monza, with GM owning 50%. Prefer SUVs? For $17,000, the Chevrolet Groove appears, which is really the Chinese Baojun 510, another product of the SAIC GM Wuling venture, where GM owns 44%. The Chevrolet Captiva, starting at $20,000, is actually the Baojun 530, also marketed as the Wuling Almaz. Again, GM's stake is just 44%. And while the Chevrolet Trax is made in both North Korea and China, your guess is as good as mine about which country supplies Mexico's inventory. Pickups have always been an American stronghold, yet the S10 Max arrives straight from China with a competitive $19,000 starting price. The Max isn't about capacity. It's short for Maxus, because this truck is actually the Maxus T70 pickup wearing a Chevy badge. The most troubling part? The Maxus brand is 100% SAIC-owned, not a joint venture. Badge and name aside, this vehicle is entirely SAIC with zero GM DNA. The upcoming models page reveals more of the same. Mexico will soon get the Spark EUV, a rebadged Baojun Yep Plus, which is 44% GM, and the Express Max van, a Maxus eDeliver 7 with GM badges slapped on it. The Maxus connection is particularly egregious. It has absolutely no relationship to GM, except for the badge. This, by the way, is where I stopped being a GM fan. I love GM's engineering heritage and I truly wish them success, but only as a developer and producer of vehicles, not as a deceptive sales channel for Chinese vehicles. It's not even a matter of China. If GM were somehow rebadging Lamborghinis without disclosure, I might admire the company that developed the cars, Lamborghini, but I would despise GM. Using the hallowed S10 name on an unrelated Chinese pickup crosses a line, especially since I know from my previous research that this is just the beginning. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Am I overreacting, or has GM's management squandered whatever credibility they once had? Looking at the bigger picture, what most analysts miss is the peculiar trade imbalance this creates. The U.S. imports GM cars from Mexico, but Mexico imports most of its GMs from China. The value flow is severely lopsided, with revenues flowing one way from the USA to China. What we're witnessing isn't GM's perfect plan. It's in fact SAIC's perfect plan, with GM management providing the sheep's clothing legitimacy and the sales channels. Interestingly, SAIC's strategy to circumvent tariffs through production in other low-cost countries extends beyond Mexico. Anticipating EU tariffs on Chinese-made vehicles, they've already started manufacturing models like the MG4 EV in Thailand, with plans to export them to Europe once they meet the 40% local content requirements. Clarifying here that I have nothing about SAIC, they just want to sell cars and are good at what they do. My beef here is with GM's management, which isn't just selling cars, but also selling out. 5E, Biden's tariffs. In 2018, President Trump put a 25% tariff on Chinese cars, and in late 2023, President Biden raised the tariff on Chinese EVs to 100%. Trump will possibly implement another round of tariffs soon, potentially targeting Mexican-made vehicles, but for now, let's stick to the previous rounds. When Trump introduced his tariff, GM fought hard against it. So when Biden dramatically increased the rate, I was puzzled. Biden has historically maintained good relations with GM and appeared at major GM events. How could he impose such a punishing tariff that seemed to contradict their interests? The answer was striking in its simplicity. This tariff didn't hurt GM, it helped them. Before proceeding, I want to clarify that I'm not making a political statement. This is purely about the automotive industry, and I believe both presidents were genuinely concerned with protecting American manufacturing when implementing these tariffs. But Biden's tariff was cunningly structured to benefit GM's evolving strategy. First, while Trump's tariff disrupted GM's original plans to import directly from China, Biden's tariff arrived just as GM had pivoted to importing Chinese-designed vehicles from Mexico. Rather than hurting GM, it effectively shielded their Sino-Mexican imports from direct Chinese competition. Second, notice the crucial difference in wording. Trump's 25% tariff applied broadly to Chinese cars, while Biden's 100% tariff specifically targeted Chinese EVs. This distinction allowed the Buick Envision, GM's best-selling Chinese import and a conventional vehicle, to continue entering the U.S. under the previous lower tariff rates. The precision of these tariffs wasn't coincidental. They surgically protected GM's evolving global strategy while appearing to take a tough stance on Chinese imports. 5F, Trump's new tariffs. With uncertainty looming over potential Mexican import tariffs, GM has already frozen plans to manufacture the Buick Electra E5 in Mexico. This isn't merely a scheduling delay. It's a strategic paralysis that reveals the fragility of their entire EV approach. Should substantial tariffs materialize, GM would face an existential choice. Either abandon the American EV market entirely or commit to building SAIC-designed vehicles on American soil. They would still be using Chinese engineering rather than homegrown GM technology, but at least manufacturing jobs and some economic benefits would remain in the country whose taxpayers saved GM from extinction. There's a certain poetic justice in this potential outcome. After taking billions in American taxpayer money and subsequently dismantling their global engineering capabilities, GM may be forced by policy to reconnect with American manufacturing, even if they're essentially acting as an assembly contractor for Chinese designs. As an engineer who once admired GM's technical prowess, I find myself in the unexpected position of hoping these tariffs materialize. GM's management has gone bad, and sometimes external pressure is the only force powerful enough to drive meaningful change in companies that have rotted to the core. Chapter 6, Doing the Impossible Twice. 3 years ago, when I first started digging into what became my mini-series, How GM Sold America, I stumbled upon a conclusion so outrageous, I almost didn't believe it myself. GM had a secret plan to import everything from China. I backed it up with evidence, titled a video accordingly, and braced myself for backlash. But even then, I had doubts. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe GM's pivot to US EV production was real. Maybe they weren't about to become a rebranded distributor of Chinese cars. But I wasn't wrong. The tariffs didn't stop GM's plan. They just delayed it and rerouted it through Mexico. And part of me wants to say, fine, that's capitalism. It's normal for companies to manufacture where it makes sense. GM builds cars in Korea, Ford builds some in Mexico, Volkswagen does it too. No problem. Except this isn't just a few models, it's the whole damn lineup. And it's not just where they build, it's who's actually in charge. They're not even selling GMs anymore. It's SAIC GM, which is 50% GM. It's SAIC GM Wuling, which is 44% GM. It's Maxus pickups and vans, which are 0% GM at all. And I hope that at the very least most cars would be of the 50% GM group, but the opposite is true. Out of 8 Chinese cars, 5 were 44% GM, 2 were 0% GM, and only 1 was 50%. This is by design. I've seen this happen in China. Unless change is forced upon them, I expect that ultimately all GMs globally, including USA, will be 100% SAIC with a GM badge. And even the SAIC GM car is based on a Chinese design, not a pure GM produced in China. This is meaningful, because SAIC GM paid GM royalties for GM designs. But once they clone a local car, no royalties are required. Even in the so-called GM models, the technology isn't even theirs anymore. I mean, it was, but they gave it away, lost the expertise, and now they're just middlemen for Chinese automakers. And the S10 Max is just the beginning. If they get away with this, you and I both know where this ends. With every future GM truck, SUV, and EV rolling off a Chinese assembly line, GM badges slapped on the front. And yet, after all this, had Ford, Honda, or VW done this, I would have said, fine, that's capitalism. But GM is different. This is the same company that emptied its war chest until 2008, drove itself into bankruptcy, and then cried to the government for a bailout. And when they got tens of billions of taxpayer dollars, did they use it to rebuild? To reinvest in American manufacturing? No. They funneled billions into stock buybacks and executive bonuses, all while quietly laying the groundwork to shift everything overseas. And they're still at it. Even now, they suck up massive subsidies. Even before the IRA, they were already raking in billions. And even when they moved their headquarters lately, they tried to make Detroit pay for renovating the old building, threatening to tear it down if Detroit doesn't pay up. And then I look across town, at Ford, at a company fighting to survive, at a company that didn't take a bailout in 2008, at a company with a CEO who actually cares about the industry, who drives competitor cars, who talks openly about what they do better, a company that's not perfect, but is at least honest about what it's trying to do. And that brings me to the 2 impossible things that happened. First, they turned me from a GM guy into a Ford guy. I never thought this would be possible, but I care about manufacturing, engineering, and honesty. And only one of these companies still values those things. I truly hope that Ford will prevail. It will be an uphill battle against the huge wave of Chinese cars that's sweeping global markets, but they have a great CEO who is adamant to see the company succeed. And they have a board which, along with the Ford family, fully supports this CEO, so they won't do to him what VW did to Herbert Diess. And they have a great team which is driven to succeed, and they are running it agile via Skunkworks. So yes, Ford does have a fighting chance, and I'll be rooting for them along the way. Making a GM guy bleed Ford blue seemed pretty impossible, but GM did something even more impossible. I am all in on Tesla, but I have bought over $3,000 of GM stock. Do not take this as investment advice because I didn't buy them as an investment. I bought them because if I hold them for over 3 years, I'll be eligible to submit proposals to be voted on in GM's investor meetings. Will they pass? No. Will they even take me seriously? No. But let me air it. Let me call them out. Because if GM wants to sell out everything, to abandon innovation, abandon engineering, and become nothing more than a reseller of Chinese cars, then at least they're going to have to face the fire for it. So thank you, Jim Farley, for being an inspiring leader for Ford, but no thanks to Mary Barra for destroying GM. I think the best way to end this is with a quote. Years ago, the ignition switch in many GM cars was faulty and could turn off mid-drive, disabling the steering while the car was in motion. When GM management found out, they decided not to report or recall it, as they calculated that paying off the families of those who died in the crashes would cost less than fixing the defect. That immoral decision cost 124 lives, with many more wounded and maimed. And when the shit was about to hit the fan, GM tried to cover up by giving the fixed part the same inventory number as the faulty one. During congressional hearings about the cover-up, Barra and other GM executives were grilled, but her response was always the same. I don't remember. That was the old GM. Post-bailout, they claimed they were a new company, not responsible, not to blame. In response, Senator Barbara Boxer said, "If this is the new GM leadership, it's pretty lacking. I am very disappointed. Really, as a woman to woman, I am very disappointed because the culture that you are representing here today is a culture of the status quo. So is this just capitalism, and GM should be able to make cars wherever it wants? Or is there a moral problem in that? After all the billions they got from American taxpayers. And Mary Barra has so many accolades and awards. Which award would you give her? Let me know below. I really want to hear your thoughts. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Consider supporting me on Patreon for as little as $1 a month or subscribing on X. Either way, you'll get ad-free access to all my videos. Click the links below. Your support makes these videos possible. A huge thank you to my latest patrons: Simon H., Douglas S., Rob L., Thomas M., Doug, Joseph E., Andres, and Julio EP. Don't forget to visit ground.news/CT-Dots to stay informed on breaking news and avoid misleading narratives, with 40% off the Vantage plan which I use. For daily insights, follow me on X at x.com/connectingodots. Until next time, I am connecting the dots, and you are amazing.